Picture a scorching sun blazing over the rugged Dakota plains. Three sisters clutching each other's hands stand on a worn-out porch, their eyes wide with terror. Their father, a man with greed etched into his soul, has just exchanged them for a pocketful of gold coins. Across the yard, a wealthy mining baron and his sons leer like wolves. Far in the distance, Lakota warriors on horseback, three brothers bound by blood, sense the winds of injustice. In this land of swirling dust and broken promises, courage is tested, loyalty is shattered, and fate comes calling for every soul. This is where our story begins. The year was 1877, and the dusty boomtown of Deadwood in the Dakota Territory rattled with the roar of wagons and the bustle of gold seekers. The place was infamous for its saloons. Gunfights and fortunes made and lost by day's end. Merchants, outlaws, prospectors, and even traveling showmen converged on its muddy streets, dreaming of wealth pulled from the earth. Realities were harsh, though, and hidden behind those wooden storefronts and glittering gold nuggets lay heartbreak and cruelty. On the outskirts of town, in a sun-scorched patch of land, stood a ramshackle house built of weathered boards. Its occupant, one Josiah Wendell, was rumored to be cruel and cunning, though few truly knew the extent of his ruthlessness. He was a tall, lanky figure with cold blue eyes, eyes that had long lost any trace of paternal warmth. Surviving on the fringes of mining camps and shady deals, Josiah relied on a combination of charm and menace to wrest coin from unsuspecting drifters. Whiskey was his closest friend. Desperation and greed were his daily bread. Inside that house, three sisters, Rebecca the eldest at 19, Clara the middle child at 17, and baby Juliet, just 15, breathed quietly, hopeful for a better tomorrow. Yet fearful of the father they barely understood, Rebecca remembered a time, however brief, when Josiah had shown traces of warmth. He would take her on his knee and whisper fanciful stories of lost gold mines, hidden valleys, and hidden treasure. But those moments were fleeting, replaced by slurred curses and violent episodes after Josiah's wife, the girl's mother, died from pneumonia when Juliet was only 4. The last vestiges of the father's kindness seemed to vanish as they buried her under a crude wooden cross near the house. Since then, Rebecca had tried to fill the motherly role for her sisters, cooking what meager food they could gather, washing clothes in a battered metal tub and shielding them from Josiah's wrath as best she could. She worked odd jobs for pittance, often helping launder clothes in Deadwood's back alleys, or picking up scraps for the local seamstress, using any excuse to keep her sisters fed and out of her father's way. But trouble lurked. Josiah's addiction to drink and gambling debts had grown heavier by the day. Rumor had it he owed money not just to ruffians in town, but also to an expanding mining operation known as the Black Horizon Company, whose unscrupulous owners had established dominance in the nearby hills. Those owners, two feuding cousins named Malcolm Grant and Abner Pike, were known for their cold hearts and their willingness to exploit the desperate for profit. On a scorching August morning, the father entered the house with the sharp stench of whiskey trailing behind him. He had a new proposition for the three sisters, one that would shatter their world. With a sly grin and a meager wave of gold coins, he proclaimed, "Girls, we're heading out. Somebody important is paying me well for a favor, an arrangement that'll solve all our troubles." Alarmed by his sudden enthusiasm, Rebecca tried to stand tall, her hazel eyes meeting her father's. "And what arrangement is that, Pa?" she demanded, half expecting another one of his shady dealings. Clara and Juliet hovered just behind her hearts, pounding Josiah with a lopsided grin, spat a wad of tobacco onto the floorboards. we're meeting a man named Malcolm Grant. He's a big shot in the Black Horizon. I hammered out a deal that'll help us more than you'll ever know." He refused to meet their gaze directly. "It's time you girls earned your keep. We all gotta make sacrifices." The sisters exchanged nervous glances. There was an ice-cold knot in Rebecca's gut that she couldn't shake. She could sense something dreadful in her father's voice, something that reeked of betrayal, deeper than any they'd known before. Meanwhile, in a Lakota village, nestled beside a winding river, not too far from the mining camp, 3 brothers sat in a circle, discussing a sense of foreboding. They felt Chaitan the eldest was calm, yet fiercely protective. He stood out for his thoughtful eyes and strong presence, one that came from a lineage of proud warriors. Hallion the middle brother was quick-witted and fiery-tempered, often found practicing with his bow or testing the edges of his newly forged knives. The youngest Taki had a gentle soul and a gift for communicating with the local wildlife hawks, wolves, even the quiet deer grazing at dawn. Though tensions with the influx of miners had been rising for years, the Lakota people sought to maintain their sacred connection to the land. These brothers were raised on stories of respect, courage, and harmony with nature. Yet the relentless expansion of mining companies, especially the Black Horizon, which had begun blasting through hills once considered sacred, foreshadowed a conflict that would not end easily. One day, Chaitan met a traveling merchant, passing near their village. The merchant told him in hushed tones of new turmoil, outside Deadwood rumors of forced labor kidnapping, and a father who had turned on his own daughters, selling them to cover his debts. The merchant speculated the 3 young women might be taken to the mines. Something in Chaitan's spirit stirred. He shared the tale with his brothers, and they were all troubled. They agreed to keep watch and intervene if they could. If the rumors proved true, night settled on Deadwood with a hush that belied the day's chaos. Saloons still rang with the drunken laughter of gamblers, but outside of town, Josiah Wendell had coaxed the sisters onto a rickety wagon. A single oil lantern flickered in the dark, illuminating Josiah's sullen face, and the drawn features of his daughters. Rebecca kept looking over her shoulder at her sisters, trying to calm them with a forced smile. Clara clutched Juliet's hand so tightly that both began to lose feeling, each trying to find the other's courage in that grip. They arrived at a clearing near the edge of the old pines, where a small group of men waited. Malcolm Grant and Abner Pike were unmistakable, one tall and wiry, the other short and heavy-set. Their eyes glinted with avarice behind the lantern's glow. They were accompanied by a handful of hired gunsmen who smelled of sweat and whiskey and carried revolvers at their hips. Josiah jumped down from the wagon and approached the men. The sisters listened in shock as he began bartering over them like cattle. "I brought all 3, he declared, forcing a shaky grin. "You said you needed young hands for the new claim. That's them now." The money, Malcolm Grant took a leather pouch from his coat pocket and tossed it at Josiah's feet. From the dull thud, Rebecca could guess there were enough coins to pay every debt her father owned 10 times over. And that meant the men would surely use them exactly how they pleased. Rebecca's heart hammered in her chest as she realized the finality of her father's treachery. Clara gasped, face pale, and Juliet's lip trembled. None of the girls could believe what was happening. Their own father, whatever flicker of paternal instinct might have existed, was now completely consumed by greed. Desperation had led him to this. There was no turning back. Malcolm Grant eyed the sisters with cold precision. "They can work in the laundry for the miners," he said slowly, as though tasting each word. "Maybe the kitchens. The men get mighty lonely out here." Abner Pike gave a snorting laugh. Now, let's not forget there's also the mine offices. The men always like new distractions." A filthy insinuation hung in his tone, That was all the sisters needed to hear. Rebecca sprang to her feet, fists clenched at her sides, but a hired gun stepped forward, pressing a revolver to her temple. Clara cried out, and Juliet whimpered in terror. Malcolm motioned for calm easy, he said in a mocking tone. We need them alive, and in one piece, you fool. Then, turning to Josiah, he spoke with finality. Our deal stands. I expect no trouble unless you want to experience trouble yourself. Mr. Wendell, Josiah only nodded, eyes averted from his daughter's horrified stares. The sisters were forcibly loaded onto another wagon, one owned by the Black Horizon Company. In that single terrible moment, they realized the betrayal was complete. Word traveled fast through the camps near Deadwood. In a single day, rumors of 3 captive sisters circulated among the locals, whispered in saloons and around campfires. Some folks pitied them. Others thought the father a monster. Yet most remained silent, afraid to challenge the mining barons who wielded enormous power that came with a small army of hired guns and the tacit blessing of certain corrupt lawmen. Miles away in the Lakota camp, Chayton listened to the new gossip from an acquaintance who sometimes traded goods in town. The friend recounted how Josiah Wendell had sold his daughters to Malcolm Grant and Abner Pike. Such cruelty cannot go unchallenged, the friend urged quietly, though fear tinged his voice. People say the sisters are bound for the company's encampment near Homestake Mine. The men there, they have no mercy. Chayton's jaw tightened. Halion and Tarka both tensed at the news. We must help Halion, said, restlessness shining in his eyes. We cannot simply watch as they suffer. Tarka gave a solemn nod, adding, Our father always taught us that the earth's children, be they of our tribe, or not, deserve protection from evil. Chayton agreed, though he knew the path ahead would be fraught with danger. They had to proceed carefully and with cunning. There would be no easy way to free these 3 sisters from the clutches of Black Horizon. In the encampment near the mouth of Homestake Mine, a cluster of tents, wooden shacks and half-finished buildings sprawled under the relentless sun. The clang of metal on rock echoed day and night as men toiled in the shafts, searching for gold. At the center stood a large canvas tent where Malcolm Grant and Abner Pike oversaw their operation. Dozens of heavily armed guards patrolled the perimeter. You could almost taste the tension in the air. Everyone was on edge, driven by the promise of the next big vein of gold, and the fear of what might happen if they failed to produce results. Rebecca, Clara, and Juliet were thrown into a cramped corner of an old storage shed, given threadbare blankets to sleep on, and a single candle that flickered feebly in the darkness. Their first task was to scrub laundry for the miners from dawn until dusk near a makeshift wash station outside. Any sign of resistance was met with a backhand from a guard or the cold click of a cocked revolver. Despite the brutality, Rebecca encouraged her sisters. We have to stay strong, she whispered, hugging them close in the night. There has to be a way out of here. Clara blinked away tears. But who would help us? Father sold us. We have nothing left. Juliet nodded numbly, her eyes reflecting hopelessness. Neither sister knew it yet, but help was already stirring from an unlikely corner, from 3 Lakota brothers who would risk everything to rescue them. Every day at first light, the sisters were herded from their storage shed prison to the wash station. The searing sun offered no mercy, and the sisters' hands soon blistered from scrubbing the grime and sweat from mountains of miners' clothing. Water was scarce, and soap even scarcer, so the tedious task felt impossible. They could hear the laughter and curses of the rough men, who strode by, some of whom made lewd comments or gestures. Rebecca tried to shield Clara and Juliet, but it was nearly impossible. The guards leered just as much as the miners, At midday, they received stale bread and watery soup. Then it was back to work, until darkness swallowed the camp. Each night they returned, exhausted arms, trembling tears stinging their eyes. Yet somehow they clung to hope. They quietly observed the camp, searching for weaknesses, places where the guards failed to keep watch, or times when a wagon might roll in or out unguarded. Like trapped birds, they sought even the tiniest crack in their cage. Meanwhile, rumors reached Malcolm Grant's ears that someone was stirring trouble in Deadwood, inquiring about the three sisters. He ordered a tightening of security, doubling the perimeter guard. Abner Pike cursed at the extra expense, but understood. They both knew how quickly a scandal could undermine their operation. If these sisters were rescued, it might embolden others to stand up to the Black Horizon's cruelty. Profits might suffer, and that was something the two barons could never allow. At the Lakota village, Chayton Halion and Taki prepared themselves. They spoke with their elders quietly, detailing the plight of the three sisters, while some of the older villagers cautioned against stirring conflict with the ever-growing tide of miners. The younger warriors recognized the moral imperative. The land was already scarred with greed and violence. How could they stand idly by while 3 innocent women were enslaved? After careful deliberation, the elders agreed to let the brothers undertake a rescue mission, provided they acted with wisdom and stealth. A direct confrontation might bring the wrath of an entire mining army upon their people. To gain an advantage, the brothers needed knowledge. They sent Halion to Deadwood to gather intelligence under the guise of trading goods. He was adept at blending in, speaking enough English to negotiate prices and gather rumors. He spent evenings in dimly lit saloons, quietly listening to the talk of miners and drifters. Before long, he learned the location of the sisters' captivity and the level of security. He heard chilling accounts of the father who had sold them and the 2 ruthless men who now owned their fates. Once he had gathered enough information, Halion slipped out of Deadwood under the cover of night, returning to the village. The brothers' hearts, heavy with the stories they had heard, began planning their next move. In the Black Horizon camp, an unexpected visitor arrived one morning, a traveling preacher named Father Malone. He was an older man with kind eyes and a worn Bible, determined to offer spiritual counsel to men laboring at the mine. Malcolm Grant saw an opportunity to appear respectable and allowed the preacher some limited access. The men might appreciate a bit of salvation, or so he cynically reasoned. It cost him nothing. Father Malone's presence brought a small dose of compassion into the brutal camp. He noticed the 3 sisters slaving away at the laundry station, bruises visible on their arms, exhaustion etched into their faces. During a lull in activity, he approached them with gentle concern. "My children, what has brought you to this sorry place?" he asked quietly, pressing a small cross into Rebecca's trembling hands. Rebecca hesitated, casting a glance at the guards, but the kindness in the preacher's eyes emboldened her to whisper, "We were sold by our father to pay his debts to these men. We have no one to protect us." Her voice quivered, rage and sorrow barely contained. Father Malone's eyes darkened, and he whispered words of comfort, promising to do what he could. Before he left, he discreetly handed them a small slip of paper. On it was an address for a mission on the outskirts of Deadwood. "If ever you find a chance to flee," he said in a low voice, "seek refuge there." That night, huddled in their makeshift prison, the sisters examined Father Malone's slip of paper. The address was scrawled in a shaky script: St. Francis Mission, Deadwood Road. Hope flickered within them for the first time in days. It seemed impossible to escape the ring of armed men, but the knowledge of a potential safe haven fueled their resolve. Rebecca pressed the paper to her heart, silently vowing that if an opportunity arose, they would make a break for it across the camp. Malcolm Grant and Abner Pike were enjoying whiskey in a larger tent, their conversation drifting to the sisters. It was a wise move acquiring them, Abner noted smugly. Not only do they handle some chores, but the men seem a bit more cooperative with them around. Malcolm nodded. Yes, but we need to keep a close watch. Womenfolk in a camp of rough men can cause trouble. Already heard a couple fights broke out over them. We can't afford disruptions. The gold must flow. During this conversation, a guard entered to report suspicious movement in the woods around the perimeter. Footprints that did not belong to the regular patrol. Malcolm stiffened. Double the guard. I want watchers out on every ridge. If someone's creeping around here, I want them caught and taught a lesson. A ripple of fear spread through the camp. The Lakota brothers' covert scouting had not gone unnoticed. Outside the camp, Chayton crouched behind a thicket of scrub pine, carefully mapping the guards' patterns. Halion and Taki flanked him, each scanning different sectors of the dimly lit perimeter. They could smell the sweat and exhaustion of the guards, the acrid smoke from campfires, and the faint tang of gunpowder in the air. This was no small operation. The men who ran this place had invested heavily in securing their profits. A direct assault would be suicidal. Halion whispered, "We need a plan that uses distraction. We cannot break the sisters out by force, alone." Taki glanced at his older brother. "Perhaps we can create a commotion in one area while you slip in from another. We know they must keep the sisters somewhere inside that ring of tents." Chayton nodded, his expression grave. "We must be swift. Once we free them, the entire camp will erupt." As they slipped away into the darkness, a watchful guard caught a glimpse of movement. Shouting erupted. Shots rang out, splitting the night air. The brothers' practiced hunters melted into the forest, leaving behind confusion and heightened alertness. Though they escaped, they knew their attempt to gather intelligence had stirred a hornet's nest. The next time they came, stealth would be even harder to achieve. Days turned into a grim routine for the sisters. Wash, scrub, serve dinner, and endure the constant leers and threats. Clara's body trembled with fear, and Juliet often wept silently when no one was watching. Rebecca held them together with fierce determination, but even her strong will began to crack under the unrelenting cruelty. The only spark of hope remained the slip of paper from Father Malone, and the faint dream of rescue. Behind the scenes, the Lakota brothers worked on a bold plan. They enlisted the help of a few sympathetic townspeople in Deadwood, a blacksmith named Thomas McAllister, who despised the brutality of the mining barons, and an older widow, Mrs. O'Donnell, whose grown son had died working under dangerous conditions in one of Grant and Pike's mines. Both McAllister and Mrs. O'Donnell were quietly recruiting local vigilantes, tired of Black Horizon's reign of terror. Together, they aimed to coordinate a nighttime operation that could catch the camp off guard. They built a network of watchers who would light signal lanterns if the Baron's men headed into town. Wagons would be readied at a moment's notice. Medical supplies would be stashed at Mrs. O'Donnell's house. The brothers knew they had to move quickly before the sisters' spirits and bodies were irreparably broken. Meanwhile, Josiah Wendell roamed Deadwood's saloons, flush with money. He reveled in a spree of drinking and gambling. It seemed every time he thought about his daughters, he pushed them from his mind with another round of whiskey. Some nights, though, the guilt ate at him. In his drunken haze, he found himself haunted by nightmares, visions of the three girls screaming, or of his deceased wife accusing him from beyond the grave. But at daybreak, he'd drown those sorrows in more liquor, convincing himself he had no choice. The times had been too desperate. Word of the rumored rescue mission buzzed around Deadwood's underbelly, reaching even Josiah's ears. At first, he sneered at the idea, cursing the sisters for not simply accepting their lot in life, but as the talk grew louder, a knot of worry formed in his gut. What if they escaped and came after him? He knew how vile his betrayal was, and the thought of facing them, freed and vengeful, unsettled him. Yet pride and greed kept him from taking any steps to aid them or rectify his wrongdoing. The seeds of retribution were planted. Like storm clouds rolling over the plains, the tension grew heavier, day by day, promising a thunderous reckoning for all involved. On a sweltering afternoon, the sisters were toiling under the watchful eyes of two burly guards when an unexpected commotion broke out near the mine entrance. One of the tunnels had caved in, trapping 4 miners underground. The alarm bell clanged, sending men scrambling for shovels and ropes. The entire camp descended into chaos as Malcolm Grant barked orders, and Abner Pike hollered about the cost of wasted time. The guards left their posts in a hurry to aid in the rescue or to help maintain order. Leaving the sisters momentarily less supervised, Rebecca sensed an opportunity. Now she hissed, pulling Clara and Juliet away from the wash station. They ducked behind a row of barrels, hearts pounding. They knew they wouldn't get far in broad daylight, but perhaps they could hide until nightfall and slip away. Carefully, they crept around the outskirts of the camp, discovering a small storage tent, filled with shovels, lanterns, and sacks of grain. They crouched behind the sacks, stifling their breath, waiting for darkness. Hours crawled by. A single guard eventually ventured inside to grab a lantern. He nearly stumbled over Clara's foot, which was peeking from behind a grain sack. Rebecca's hand flew to her mouth in panic, but fortune or fate let the guard remain oblivious. He lit his lantern, grumbled about the heat, and left slamming the tent flap behind him. Relief washed over the sisters, but their hearts thundered with the knowledge of how close they'd come to discovery. As dusk settled, the Lakota brothers made their move. They had spent the day hidden in the forest, watching the camp endure the mine cave-in crisis. The meltdown provided an opening for infiltration. Their allies from Deadwood had lit signals indicating that a modest group of armed supporters were nearby, ready to help. The plan was for Chayton Halion and Taki to slip into the camp, locate the sisters, and once they were clear, use a distraction to escape the chaos. Night fell, and the guards switched shifts. Lanterns glowed against the silhouettes of tents. The clang of pickaxes in the distance meant the miners were still frantically clearing rubble. Tension rippled through the air like an electrical charge before a storm. Chayton led the way, creeping through the underbrush. Halion, more nimble, flanked him, and Taki circled to the far side to cut off any possible retreat by the guards. At precisely the agreed-upon moment, a distant explosion rocked the hillside. McAllister the blacksmith had used a small crate of dynamite to blow a section of the supply road, ensuring no reinforcements would quickly arrive from the neighboring camps. The thunderous echo sent the guards into a frenzy. Guns were drawn, shouts rang out, and in the confusion, the Lakota brothers slipped into the heart of the camp. The thunderous explosion shook the ground beneath their feet, a sharp, violent sound that ripped through the night and set the entire camp ablaze with confusion. Shouts erupted in every direction, men screaming orders, guards calling for backup, and frightened miners rushing toward the supply road. The once oppressive rhythm of the camp dissolved into chaos. For a fleeting moment, it felt as though the very air had cracked open. Inside the dim canvas tent where they'd taken shelter, Rebecca, Clara, and Juliet clung to each other, eyes wide, breaths short. Their hearts beat like frantic drums, echoing the panic outside. They could feel the tremors in the earth, the weight of something irreversible unfolding. What was that? Clara whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know, Rebecca replied, clutching the slip of paper Father Malone had given them. Her fingers trembled. But it might be our chance. They huddled closer, pressing themselves against the sacks of grain that had served as their hiding place, every second stretched heavy with both dread and fragile hope. The shadows cast by flickering lanterns outside danced across the tent walls like ghosts. Footsteps pounded past. A guard shouted something about reinforcements. Then silence, terrifying and uncertain, fell for just a breath. Suddenly the tent flap rustled. Rebecca's body tensed. Her first instinct was to shield her sisters, even if it meant throwing herself in front of them. Her mind raced. Was it a guard? A drunken miner, had they been discovered? But then the flap parted gently, and through it stepped a tall figure, draped in soft leather and shadow's braids falling over his shoulders, eyes sharp with resolve. Behind him followed another man, younger, leaner with a dagger at his side, and a watchful gaze. At the tent's entrance, a third stood guard bow, drawn an arrow, knocked eyes scanning the night like a hawk. The sisters froze. Then Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. She recognized them not by name, but by spirit. These were the Lakota brothers. She had seen their kind around Deadwood, before quiet and proud eyes, filled with stories that few took the time to hear. But here now, in this terrible moment, they appeared not as strangers, but as saviors. The tallest stepped forward and spoke softly, haltingly in English. "We come to help you. Leave with us." Now the words, though simple, struck Rebecca like a thunderclap. Are you real?" Clara whispered, half in disbelief, half in prayer. Juliet burst into quiet sobs, her fear cracking under the pressure of sudden hope. Halion moved quickly, handing each sister a rough cloak, large enough to drape over their heads and cover their dresses. "Wear these," he murmured. "Hide your faces. Move silent." Taki gave a low whistle outside, signaling the all clear. Rebecca stood legs unsteady, but filled with new strength. She looked at the man who had spoken, Chaitan. There was something unshakable in his eyes, something she hadn't seen in anyone in a long time, Honor. She nodded. "We're ready." Clara and Juliet followed, barely daring to believe they were walking toward freedom. As they stepped out into the cool night air, the noise of the camp swelled again. Shouts, gunfire, and the rumble of boots. Smoke from the explosion hung in the air like a warning. Taki led the way, crouched low. Halion brought up the rear, scanning the dark. The group slipped between tents and behind supply carts, moving like shadows among the flickering chaos. As they crept through the camp, the sisters' minds flooded with memories, the ache of their work-worn hands, the sting of backhanded blows, the sound of men's laughter laced with cruelty. But now that torment gave way to something fragile and trembling, the belief that escape was no longer just a dream. In that moment, cloaked by darkness and carried by the courage of 3 strangers, the sisters took their first real steps toward freedom, and though they knew the road ahead would be perilous, they no longer walked it alone. The camp was unraveling. Screams echoed through the dark as guards scrambled like ants in a kicked nest, chasing shadows and shouting orders no one could hear over the chaos. Smoke from the supply road explosion drifted through the pine trees, curling around the tents like a ghost. Horses neighed wildly, sensing the panic, their hooves striking the earth with fear. But amid the uproar, 6 figures slipped quietly between tents and wagons, silent, swift, desperate. Rebecca clutched the reins of her fear, drawing strength from Chaitan's steady steps ahead. His movements were deliberate, instinctual. He didn't falter, even as armed men sprinted past them, distracted by the distant fire and gunshots. Clara kept one hand gripping the cloak that shielded her face, the other tightly around Juliet's wrist. The youngest sister stumbled once on a loose stone, and Clara steadied her with a hushed whisper. "We're almost there. Just a little more." Behind them, Helion watched every shadow, every flicker of movement. His hand hovered near the hilt of his blade heart, pounding, not from fear, but from urgency. He could feel it in his bones. This moment had to go right. There would be no second chance. In the distance, over the din of chaos, the sharp crack of gunfire split the night again. The sisters flinched instinctively, ducking. A burst of orange fire lit up the ridge. Mrs. O'Donnell's vigilantes were holding their ground, delaying the Baron's men with rifles and righteous fury. It was working, but they were running out of time. Malcolm Grant, wild-eyed and spitting orders, stormed through the center of camp. "Find them," he bellowed. "I want those girls back. Search every tent, every damn shack now." Abner Pike stumbled after him, pale with rage. "We should have killed that preacher when we had the chance," he muttered, fumbling to load his pistol. "Those brats are ruining everything." Chayton led the group toward the tree line on the far edge of the camp there. Hidden beneath a dense grove of pines, 6 horses waited, their breaths misting in the cool air, ears twitching at the distant chaos. Take stood guard beside them, a quiet silhouette against the moonlight. Rebecca hesitated for just a second as she approached the horses, staring at the forest beyond. "Can this be real?" she whispered. "Are we really leaving?" Chayton turned to her, his voice low but certain. "Yes, but we must ride." Now one by one, the sisters mounted awkwardly at first hands, shaking bodies weak from days of labor and fear. Take helped Juliet swing her leg over the saddle, offering a reassuring nod. Helion checked the reins, handed Clara a small canteen, and gave the signal. Then together, they rode. The pounding of hooves shattered the quiet in the trees, a rhythm of defiance against all they'd suffered. The wind tore at their cloaks, whipping through hair and fabric as they plunged into the Badlands, into the unknown, into freedom. But the sound of pursuit wasn't far behind. Voices roared. More gunfire cracked the air. From behind them came the unmistakable beat of riders. Grant's men had discovered the empty tent, the missing cloaks, the tracks in the dirt. Torches flared behind them, and the chase had begun. Rebecca urged her horse faster, her fingers white against the reins. Clara turned in the saddle and gasped. "They're gaining." Chayton glanced back, his eyes narrowing. "We'll lead them into the valley trail." "It's narrow, they'll have to slow down or fall." The group veered off the open plain, thundering into a twist of rocky terrain where the cliffs narrowed the path to single file. It was treacherous, but the Lakota brothers knew every bend, every hidden pass. Shots whistled past them, one striking a stone near Juliet's leg, causing the horse to rear. Helion reached out just in time, steadying her before she was thrown. Rebecca cried out, "Juliet, are you okay?" Juliet nodded breathlessly. "I'm fine, just go." Through sheer grit and luck they pushed onward. Their lungs burned, their muscles screamed, but they did not stop. Not now. They would not be prisoners again. Behind them, the Baron's men struggled their horses, slipping on the rocky incline, the narrow path preventing them from closing the distance. One rider shouted, as his horse lost footing and tumbled off the trail, taking its rider with it into the dark ravine below. The sisters didn't see it, but they heard the scream, and it reminded them just how close the edge was. Still they rode. With every hoofbeat they put their past further behind them. With every breath they dared to believe they might make it, Deadwood, and whatever hope waited, there was still far. But it had never felt closer. Within minutes, the absence of the sisters was confirmed, and armed men galloped out of the camp in pursuit. Malcolm Grant himself rode at the head of a posse, face contorted with rage. Abner Pike trailed behind, cursing with every bounce in the saddle. Their greed and pride would not allow them to lose such valuable property without a fight. Rebecca gripped her horse's reins so tightly her knuckles turned white. She glanced back to see the flicker of torches weaving through the trees in hot pursuit. Halion urged everyone to ride faster, and they thundered across open ground, heading for a narrow valley. The moon hung low, offering just enough light to avoid obstacles. Shots rang out bullets whistling overhead. One came dangerously close to Clara's side, causing her to yelp in fright. Chayton slowed his horse to position himself between the pursuers and the sisters, returning fire with his rifle. Despite being outnumbered, the Lakota brothers knew the terrain. They had scouted every valley and ridge. They navigated a hidden trail that twisted sharply, forcing the mining baron's posse to slow or risk a deadly fall. Nevertheless, the chase continued relentless. The sisters' lungs burned with a mixture of fear and hope. If they could just make it beyond this stretch of badlands and into friendlier territory near Deadwood, they might lose their pursuers for good. In the distance, the lights of Deadwood flickered a haven compared to the hell they had just fled. Drawing on every reserve of courage, the group pressed on. Take guided them through a shallow creek, hoping the water would throw off the horse's scent. The creek bed was slippery, and Clara nearly tumbled off her mount, saved only by Helion's quick hand. Behind them, the posse spread out, combing the area. Malcolm Grant spat curses into the night, urging his men to search every crevice. One of the hired guns found fresh hoofprints in the creek bank, shouting, "They went this way." The chase resumed, the men crashing through underbrush, shining lanterns into the dark corners of the wilderness. Just when it seemed they might be overtaken, a shrill whistle echoed from the far side of a ridge. It was McAllister and a few townsmen, lighting torches and waving them high. They opened fire on the pursuers, drawing attention away from the sisters. The Baron's men, startled by the ambush, turned to return fire, allowing the rescuers a precious advantage. The thunder of gunshots and panicked shouts filled the night air. Rebecca, Clara, and Juliet, guided by the Lakota brothers, seized the moment and spurred their horses onward. The final stretch to Deadwood lay ahead. Through the chaos, it was uncertain who would emerge victorious or who would even survive. At last, the group reached the outskirts of Deadwood, breathless and exhausted. The sisters' dresses were torn, their faces smeared with dirt and sweat, yet the spark in their eyes burned brighter than ever. Chayton, Halion, and Take led them to a small barn on Mrs. O'Donnell's property. The older woman rushed out with blankets, urging them inside. "Hurry, get in before the Baron's men come sniffing around," she said. Worry etched on her face. Rebecca collapsed onto a pile of hay, tears of relief streaming down her cheeks. Clara and Juliet clung to each other, trembling with shock. The Lakota brothers dismounted, patting the horses to calm them. Mrs. O'Donnell offered a quick prayer under her breath. The windows rattled faintly as gunfire continued somewhere in the distance. McAllister had led the Baron's men on a wild chase through the hills, buying the sisters time to hide. For the moment they were safe, but they all knew it was temporary. Malcolm Grant and Abner Pike would not rest until they recaptured or silenced the sisters to preserve their operation's reputation. And there remained one more element of this twisted tale. Josiah Wendell, the father who had sold them. He'd lurked in the shadows of Deadwood. His newly bought comfort threatened by the sisters' sudden freedom. Morning broke over Deadwood with a quiet hush, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Riders brought word that the Baron's posse was returning empty-handed. Injured men cursed their luck, describing ambushes by townsfolk, and the near-ghostly disappearance of the sisters. Malcolm Grant stormed into the local sheriff's office, demanding the lawman apprehend the so-called vigilantes, but the sheriff, weary of the mining baron's arrogance, feigned ignorance. "I can't arrest folks if I don't know who they are," he said with a shrug, earning a furious glare from Grant. Meanwhile, hidden in Mrs. O'Donnell's barn, the sisters huddled with Chayton, Halion and Tarky, planning their next move. Father Malone had told them about the St. Francis mission on Deadwood Road, a place that offered safe haven. They considered heading there, but the mission was only a short ride from the center of town, likely the first place the Baron's men would look. In a quiet moment, Clara placed a trembling hand over Chayton's. "Thank you," she whispered. "We wouldn't be alive without you." The eldest brother simply nodded, humility and compassion evident in his eyes. Halion and Tarky shared grateful smiles with the sisters as well. Though they came from different worlds, they were bound now by a shared cause, justice and freedom. Yet the question remained: how to ensure the sisters wouldn't be hunted down and dragged back into captivity. Word soon reached Josiah Wendell that his daughters were free. He discovered the barons were enraged, blaming him for not keeping them in line or providing better intelligence on their whereabouts. A knot of fear coiled in Josiah's stomach. If the barons lost face and money because of his daughter's escape, they might shift their wrath onto him. Anxiety gnawed at his mind as he stumbled from saloon to saloon, trying to drown his panic in whiskey. Eventually, news traveled that the sisters had found refuge, though no one seemed certain exactly where. A rumor even suggested they were under the protection of Lakota warriors. Josiah scoffed at the idea, but the more he heard the rumor repeated, the more he realized how deep in trouble he was. If the sisters came forward and publicly revealed his deed, selling them like livestock, he could be shunned, beaten, or even killed by enraged townsfolk. It was one thing to owe money to unscrupulous men, quite another to commit such a vile betrayal of his own children. Desperation pushing him into a corner, Josiah decided to do what he did best. Make a deal. He slunk through the back alleys of Deadwood, searching for men with unscrupulous loyalties. One thing was clear: he intended to salvage whatever advantage he could, no matter the cost to his daughters. Inside the barn, the sisters debated their next steps with the Lakota brothers. Rebecca insisted, "We must do more than just hide. These men will keep doing this to others if we don't stop them." Clara agreed, though fear tinged her voice. "But how can we stop them? They have money, guns, power." Juliet looked down, remembering the harrowing days in captivity. Tarky spoke up quietly. "We have allies. There are many in Deadwood who hate the barons for their cruelty, and we have watchers on the outskirts, men from our village, and townsfolk who are tired of living in fear." Halion nodded. "We can gather evidence of their crimes. If enough people stand together, the law might finally act." Chayton met Rebecca's gaze. "We can't promise it will be easy, but if we're united, we may succeed." A cautious hope spread through the barn. They devised a plan to collect testimonies from miners abused by the Black Horizon Company, gather statements from those who had witnessed the sisters' captivity, and present an unstoppable case to Deadwood's sheriff, who, although not entirely incorruptible, might be swayed by overwhelming public outcry. But to do that, they needed a measure of safety, and to ensure that Malcolm Grant, Abner Pike, and Josiah Wendell couldn't sabotage them first night. Fell once again. The group snuck out under the cover of darkness, heading to the St. Francis mission. Father Malone, alerted by Mrs. O'Donnell, was waiting by the gate with 2 nuns' lanterns in hand. He ushered them inside, offering shelter in a back room, guarded by a sturdy door. One of the nuns prepared food and fresh water, while Father Malone informed them he had discreetly spoken with some local authorities, urging them to listen to the sisters' story. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the sisters slept on clean cots. No guards, no leers, no terror. Just the soft murmur of prayer drifting through the mission walls. Yet sleep did not come easily for Rebecca. She tossed and turned, reliving each horrific moment, the bruises on her arms throbbing. In her restless dreams, she saw her father's face, looming, heard the mocking laughter of Malcolm Grant, and Abner Pike felt the desperation of captivity. Outside the Lakota brothers, and a small contingent of volunteers kept watch, rotating shifts through the night. They knew better than to underestimate the Barons. Indeed, far across town, Grant and Pike were plotting furious at the humiliating rescue. They considered hiring additional guns to raid the mission and seize the sisters back. For them, this was about more than profit. Now it was personal, a matter of pride and power. The following morning, a hush settled over Deadwood's main street as a small entourage approached the sheriff's office. At the front, Father Malone and the sisters, escorted by Chayton Halion and Taki. Behind them trailed Mrs. O'Donnell, Thomas McAllister, and a handful of miners who had mustered the courage to testify against Black Horizon. A curious crowd gathered, sensing something significant was about to unfold. Sheriff Tom Granger stood on the porch, arms folded, his expression guarded. He watched as the battered sisters told their story, describing their father's betrayal, the conditions at the camp, the forced labor, and the attempted recapture. One of the miners, still carrying bruises from a guard's beating, described the cruelty he'd witnessed. McAllister produced a ledger from an informant inside the camp, detailing illegal wages and extortion. Granger's gaze flickered with increasing disquiet as each piece of evidence mounted. He cleared his throat and said, "This is serious business. If half of what you're saying is true, we have a criminal enterprise on our hands." The crowd murmured. He turned to the sister's voice, softening. "We'll need your official statements. You'll have the protection of my office as best I can provide." Yet everyone knew that a few sworn statements wouldn't be enough to topple the Barons. If Malcolm Grant and Abner Pike felt cornered, they might lash out violently or bribe the officials to bury the evidence. The war was not over. The hearing was merely the first volley. That afternoon, tension boiled over Malcolm Grant, and Abner Pike, flanked by hired guns, stormed into town, brandishing lawyers and sneering threats. They confronted the sheriff, insisting that they were respectable businessmen, and the sisters were runaways, property rightfully purchased. Their arrogance shocked the gathering crowd. Rebecca Claro and Juliet stood trembling, but defiant, flanked by the Lakota brothers. Father Malone and their supporters demanded that the law protect the sisters. Sensing a major spectacle, gamblers, merchants, and travelers poured onto the dusty street. Accusations flew. The Barons hired guns menaced by resting hands on their revolvers. Then, just when it seemed the standoff might erupt in gunfire, Josiah Wendell stumbled into the scene. His hair was disheveled, eyes bloodshot from drink. But in that moment, fear and guilt overshadowed his greed. He realized that if the truth came out without his input, he might be hanged by the outraged townsfolk or shot by the Barons for failing them. With shaking legs, Josiah faced the crowd, and in a strained voice, confessed it all. "Yes, I sold my daughters," he admitted. A hush fell. "I was in debt, and they gave me gold for 'em. I'm no father, I'm scum. But it's the Barons who have forced 100 others to labor under threat. I've seen it. Don't let them get away with it." He trailed off, tears streaming down his face. In that extraordinary moment, Josiah's confession hammered the final nail into the Baron's coffin, stirring the crowd into a furor. An outcry echoed through Deadwood streets. The local townspeople, many of whom had lost loved ones or suffered under the Baron's unscrupulous dealings, seized this moment. They demanded justice, refusing to be silenced by threats or bribes. Under the weight of testimonies, ledgers, eyewitness accounts, and now Josiah's shocking admission, Sheriff Granger had no choice. He ordered the immediate arrest of Malcolm Grant and Abner Pike on charges of kidnapping, forced labor, and a host of other crimes. Their hired guns bristled, but the townspeople vastly outnumbered them. McAllister's vigilantes, the Lakota brothers, and newly emboldened miners formed a ring of steel around the Barons. Enraged, Malcolm Grant tried to draw his revolver, but Hallion knocked it from his grip. Abner Pike reached for a hidden derringer, only to be tackled by Tarke. The Baron's men, sensing the tide turned, dropped their weapons. In a cacophony of curses, both Barons were dragged off to the jailhouse, their proud faces stained with the dust of defeat. Exhausted and overcome by relief, the sisters stood in the center of it, all tears in their eyes. Rebecca wept into Clara's shoulder, while Juliet clung to Father Malone's arm. Josiah, broken, slumped onto the wooden sidewalk, too stunned to resist as passers-by hurled insults at him. The unstoppable force of justice had finally cornered greed and cruelty in Deadwood. In the days that followed, the story of the three sisters spread throughout the Dakota Territory. Malcolm Grant and Abner Pike languished in jail, awaiting trial on multiple charges. Their once unassailable empire collapsed as frightened subordinates cut deals with the law to save themselves, revealing more corruption and crimes. The Black Horizon Company's stranglehold on the region fractured overnight. As for Josiah Wendell, a wave of contempt fell upon him. The townspeople, outraged by his heinous betrayal, clamored for harsh punishment. Faced with such scorn and the threat of vigilante justice, he attempted to flee Deadwood one night. But karma, swift and unforgiving, would not be denied. Drunk and disoriented, he rode his horse near the old mine shafts. In the darkness, the ground gave way, and he plunged into an abandoned excavation. By morning, a search party found him, broken, barely alive. He lingered for a few miserable days, racked by fever and guilt, eventually breathing his last. Some whispered it was divine judgment for a father who sold his own flesh and blood. The sisters, though bruised by trauma, found a measure of peace at the St. Francis Mission. Father Malone arranged for them to work in the mission's modest schoolhouse, free from fear. The Lakota brothers continued to visit, forging a friendship that transcended cultural barriers. Over time, Rebecca, Clara, and Juliet each healed in their own ways, carrying forward the lessons of resilience and unity. For the land itself, still scarred by greed, their story became a beacon, reminding all who heard it that justice can prevail, but only when courage meets compassion in the face of evil. This tale of heartbreak and redemption reveals that even in the harshest landscapes where gold rush greed tramples innocent lives, hope can still find its way through. The three sisters, Rebecca, Clara, and Juliet, overcame betrayal so profound it threatened to shatter them. Yet through the selfless bravery of Chayton Hallion Tarke and the good folk of Deadwood, they reclaimed their freedom and dignity. The mining barons, once invincible, fell to a destiny of disgrace, and the cruel father Josiah met the hard karma he deserved. Thank you for joining us on this epic Wild West journey. If this story stirred your heart, share it with friends. Give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more gripping tales of courage, justice, and the indomitable human spirit. Together, we keep these legends alive, reminding ourselves that no darkness is too deep when we stand united.